Today in the EU, a European right turn on migration. Thursday's Justice and Home Affairs Council meeting marks a significant shift in the EU's approach to migration as right-wing politics gain ground across the bloc. While discussions will cover topics like Schengen and security, the focal point will be a working lunch where ministers will explore new third-country migration deals and improving the return of irregular migrants. As migration pressures grow, member states are pushing for tougher measures, reflecting the bloc's evolving, more hardline stance on both asylum and irregular migration. But what are the ministers' plans, and who would future deals be signed with? Hello and welcome. I am Evi Kiorri, and this is Today in the EU. To break this down, I spoke with our Paris-based reporter, Théo Bourgery-Gonse, who has the story. Hi, Théo. Welcome back.
Hi, Evi.
So, Justice and Home Affairs Council is meeting on Thursday. What will ministers be talking about?
Yeah, well, it's a busy day that's awaiting interior ministers of the EU 27 countries. There'll be a discussion on Schengen, a discussion on how to better fight child sexual abuse, on EU law enforcement, IT systems, and they'll be discussing how conflicts like the war in Ukraine and the situation in the Middle East is impacting security across Europe. But actually, most importantly, there will be a critical conversation at a closed-door working lunch. Now, there's not much info out there on what this conversation will be about, but we've managed at Directive to speak to a few EU diplomats. And what we understand is that the whole meal will be spent talking about third-country migration deals and a critical issue that's been coming up in political narrative, which is that of returning irregular migrants that have not been granted asylum in the EU more efficiently. And that's returning them either to their country of origin or to other non-EU transit countries, which they might have stayed in for a while prior to getting to the Schengen area. And we know that the Hungarian presidency has shared a number of questions to member states ahead of Thursday's lunch to sort of sense check where capitals are at and come up with a series of ideas and proposals that they could present to heads of states and presidents at next week's European Council.
And you're talking about the third country migration deals that we've also heard a lot about, but we don't really know what they are in practice. So what do the third country migration deals entail?
In a nutshell, these deals are with non-EU countries, and these are countries that can be of origin, as we say, that is, the countries that refugees leave hoping to make it to Europe, or transit countries that are on migration routes towards the EU. Some of these deals do exist. We know the EU-Libya deal, the EU-Turkey statement, we know of the EU-Tunisia MOU. But actually, these deals differ widely in the way they're framed, in their content, and the financial support that comes with it by the EU. But as a whole, what they try to do is that they look to prevent irregular crossings to the Schengen area. They look to improve return procedures. And they also look, to a certain extent, to externalize asylum claims processes outside of the bloc. And I should say that these deals built off of the Migration Pact, which was adopted in May and which looked to strengthen the bloc's response to irregular migration. That's, I guess, a new chapter to the way the EU thinks and the Commission thinks about migration policy.
And why are we talking about them so much today?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely been a renewed push to agree these sort of deals with EU third countries. First of all, because migration policy has been at the very core of conversations and political debates in domestic policies ahead of the European elections of June 2024. We can come back to that if you like. And in May last year, so just under a month before the June elections, 15 member states penned a letter to European Commissioner for Home Affairs, Evi Johansson. And they warned in that letter, I quote, that the current challenges regarding the EU's asylum and migration system, including a sharp increase in irregular arrivals, are unsustainable. So the way the EU has been thinking about migration is no longer fit for purpose, is essentially what they've been saying in this letter. And what they've been calling for is, I quote again, comprehensive, mutually beneficial, and durable partnerships with non-EU countries along migration routes. And they want to do that so the focus changes from managing irregular migration in Europe to supporting refugees as well as host communities in regions of origin. In other words, in layman's speak, it is to try to encourage refugees not to engage in traveling to the Schengen area.
And you've just spoken about returns. Last week, a non-paper made rounds in Brussels to call for a review of this directive and make its application more relevant to today's challenges. What is the return directive and what's the problem with it?
So the directive was first adopted in 2005, so some 20 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
and it was once reviewed in 2008. And in essence, it sets common EU standards that member states can apply when returning irregular migrants from the EU to their country of origin or other countries the EU might have passed deals with.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this directive is seen by many to no longer be fit for purpose, as migration flows have increased significantly in the past 20 years since it was first adopted. So the whole point behind that non-paper which you're referring to, which circulated last week, is that the member states are calling for, I quote, a paradigm shift in the return process. They want the review and the return to happen more quickly and more efficiently. And most importantly, they want to put the onus on obligations and duties, that's how they write it in the non-paper,
Mm-hmm.
for irregular migrants faced with a returning order. In other words, they're making those irregular migrants more accountable for the irregularity of their stay in Europe. Now, the rewriting of this directive has been years in the making, but it's never, when we look at the European Parliament, it's actually never made it past committee stage because it was lacking the necessary political backing, and it's quite a controversial and sensitive topic to engage on. And meanwhile, member states had agreed a sort of partial common stance on this specific issue back in 2019, but that's come now to a standstill. So I think the urge with that non-paper is to start negotiating a review of the return directive soon enough to have an agreement, some are saying actually as early as in 2025.
And you mentioned the documents that circulated in May. What are the member states' plans on how to front this matter? What are the ministers' proposals, if there are any?
There's been a lot of thinking going around. One idea that's mentioned in this letter, which I think is worth noting, is the creation of emergency transit mechanisms, or ETMs, which would in practice mimic those put in place by UNHCR in Libya. And under this mechanism, asylum claims of refugees in distress in Libya would be handled in safe non-EU countries. UNHCR has partnerships with Niger and Rwanda. You could imagine the EU to strike deals with either those two countries or focus on countries perhaps in the Balkans or in Northern Africa. On top of the conversation that's been happening at the EU level, it's worth also remembering that some member states have tried to go at it alone. You probably remember, Evi, of the UK that's been caught in a media storm over the Rwanda model under previous conservative premierships, whereby refugees would have automatically been denied asylum in the UK, but given the opportunity to apply for Rwandese asylum in Rwanda. That deal failed to materialize the moment Labour got back into power over the summer. There is another kind of model that's been spearheaded by Italy, and that's the Italy-Albania model, where refugees that are arrested trying to cross the Adriatic Sea from Albania to Italy have their asylum claims processed by Italian authorities in Albania. And that's been drawing quite a bit of interest from other EU interior ministers, though there remains concerns, and that's something that NGOs have been sort of a message they've been pushing forward, is that there remain concerns over the risks for fundamental human right protections that apply to refugees.
It sounds like EU ministers are willing to go hard on migration, perhaps even more than before. Germany and France, two very influential member states, are also stepping in and adopting a more tough on migration stance. What is actually happening there?
Yeah, I mean, Evi, you've seen the results of the EU elections just like I have, and there's been an evident turn to the right across the bloc, and that gets reflected in the number of right-leaning member states and member state governments, but also within the European Parliament. And so ultimately, this veering to the right has been correlated with more repressive immigration talk in the past few months and years, especially when you have the pressure of the far right that's mounting in a great number of different member states. And ultimately, migration policy has been turned into such a hot political conversation. And now there seems to be political willingness for a tougher narrative on migration, especially, as you said, as France and Germany are joining ranks. I mean, Germany recently announced in early September that it would implement checks on all land borders.
Die Zahl derjenigen, die zu uns kommen, ist zurückgegangen, weil wir zum Beispiel Grenzkontrollen eingeführt haben und jetzt zu Beginn dieser Woche auch entschieden haben.
The number of those who come to us has fallen because we have introduced border controls and have now also decided at the beginning of this week that we will continue to do this at all borders in Germany for as long as it is possible. We have had success with this and we will continue this successful approach, said Olaf Scholz in the Reichstag last month.
While France's new Home Affairs Minister, Bruno Retailleau, has hinted to a review of the Migration Pact and of the Schengen agreements, claiming that immigration was, I quote, not good luck for France.
Une très grande majorité de Français souhaitent qu'on ait plus de sécurité et moins d'immigration. Comme des millions de Français,
a vast majority of French people want more security and less immigration. Like millions of French citizens, I think migration is not a chance. Neither for migrants we are not able to welcome take-in, as it's false generosity to welcome individuals who could be dangerous. Now, the commissioner-designate in charge of migration is Magnus Berner, the current Austrian finance minister from the conservative Austrian People's Party. If approved by the European Parliament, he will be instrumental in shaping the EU's migration policy in the next 5 years. Where does he stand? What's his track record on migration?
Right, it's an interesting question to ask because, in fact, Brunner doesn't really have a migration background at all. He's been Austria's finance minister for almost 3 years. He was state secretary for climate action and energy before that. So his track record on irregular immigration is really very thin. That said, his appointment as commissioner designate has had a few observers, especially human rights NGOs, worry. The Austrian government he's been a part of has always adopted a rather strict stance on freedom of travel, and they most notably blocked Romania and Bulgaria's integration in the Schengen area in December 2023. And the result of the elections last week, which saw a surge in votes for the far-right FPO party, can only fuel concerns, I think, that the Austria commissioner designate may take a hard line on migration policy. And so it'll be incredibly interesting to listen to what Magnus Brunner has to say at the parliamentary hearings in November. And that should give us a better sense of what he wants to focus on and what goals he's setting out to achieve.
Thank you very much, Théo.
Thank you, Evi.
I am Evi Kiorri, and this was Today in the EU podcast. Visit Euractiv to stay on top of the latest news. If you haven't subscribed yet, you can find us on all streaming platforms. You can get in touch with us by leaving a comment or review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Your reviews help us a lot to spread the word about our work, but also understand what topics you like listening to. This episode was produced by Miriam Sainz Tejada, Charles Cohen, and me. Thank you for tuning in, and until tomorrow morning. As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion, and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.